Well, hello. My name is Mance Harmon. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Hedera Hashgraph. I'm very glad to be here with you today to discuss the challenges to mainstream adoption of tokenization. So with that, I, of course, have a presentation. Let me pull that up and we will get started. Here we go. So there's no shortage to prognosticators about how the market of tokenization will evolve. But here we have just last year, the ex-chair and CEO of the NASDAQ talking about how within just a few years, the $30 trillion stock market will be tokenized. Now, maybe that's a bit optimistic. Maybe the time frames will be a little longer. Things will move a little bit more slowly. But people are beginning to talk not just about what could happen, but what will happen. And I find that incredibly significant. What do we mean by tokenization? Let's just take a look at a definition. Asset tokenization refers to the process of converting real assets and ownership rights into digital assets or tokens recorded on a distributed ledger. Some examples might be real estate or land or commodities, corporate debt. They could be digital objects in online games or collectibles like trading cards and pieces of art, or even energy-related credits like carbon credits. Anything that has any value can theoretically be tokenized. And by tokenizing these assets, the friction that's normally associated with the transfer of ownership can be reduced. And in many cases, the tokenization itself results in the fractionalized ownership of the underlying asset, which may have previously been very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. In other words, tokenization gives rise to marketplaces that increase liquidity and reduce transfer and settlement costs. So how big is the market? Well, I think it's fair to say that at the end of last year, 2020, the future had not yet arrived. This is a look at the market for tokenization at the end of 2020. It does not include Bitcoin or Ethereum. If we add those two in, then we are looking at $1 trillion market, which is nice. However, if we compare that to the global stock market, it's still tiny. We are in the earliest of days, and the potential of tokenization is massive. If we look at the current opportunity, not to mention the tokenization, the fact that that tokenization will open up opportunities for financial inclusion and ownership that the current economy simply cannot address. So how big is the market? That's anybody's guess. Obviously, there's a lot of potential for tokenization. We're all very excited about tokenization, but there are challenges. And so let's take a look at what those are and how we might be able to address them. When we look at tokenization today, we see excessively high transaction fees driven by congestion on the networks that transfer the tokens. Obviously, if the transaction fees required to use the tokens or to even simply move the tokens from one platform to another, if those fees exceed the value of the token or the operation, then the whole economic model doesn't work. The transaction fees need to be tiny, and they also need to be predictable. It's also limited by the slow performance of the platforms today. The networks are already congested, which is largely why the transaction fees are so high. And tokenization is only limited use today. There's no broad-based adoption. For large-scale consumer or enterprise adoption, the platforms must be able to process many thousands of transactions per second. There's also the constant threat of network forking that, especially in the context of tokenization, can overnight destroy asset values that have been tokenized. Let me explain. If you have a token that represents an asset, that means that there's a ledger that has a list of the entities of that token and their balances. There's software that runs on a smartphone or a computer that creates transactions for moving balances, moving tokens from one account to another account. When that software is used, it just randomly reaches out to one of the nodes in the network and submits a transaction. When a network forks, what that means is that some of those nodes in the network have decided to split off from the main network, create a new network. When they do so, they take a snapshot of the state of the original network at a moment in time, which includes the ledger for the token, and then they pick up operations from that point in time in the new network. Well, you have the software out there on the clients, the smartphones and the computers, that still operates. Transactions are created. They still reach out to some random nodes. Now, some of those nodes exist in one network versus another network. They exist across two networks. Transactions get randomly submitted to each network, and the ledger, now there are two copies of that ledger, one in the old, one in the new. The ledger itself diverges. That creates chaos for the token issuer, or it has the potential to do so. This has to be addressed for tokenization to go mainstream. So that's a big problem. And then the regulatory environment is a problem. DLA Piper is one of the largest global law firms. They are also a member of the Hedera Governing Council, and they've created and brought to market a token issuance platform called Toko. What I find interesting is their perspective on the space. They don't believe getting the tech is that difficult. I mean, the tech does exist today to be able to do what we want to do from a tokenization perspective. However, the regulatory environment is a nightmare. Even for a global law firm that has the resources that DLA Piper has and the expertise in regulatory environments on a global basis, it's incredibly challenging. It could be impossible, nearly impossible, for a tech startup that doesn't have that kind of reach to be able to address the regulatory environment. So the regulatory environment is challenging. That has to be changed over time, and there are changes underway, but there needs to be a common framework that the jurisdictions on a global basis will accept and use. And then lack of accessibility. I'm referring here specifically to smart contracts. Smart contracts for the use of tokens, for the instantiation of tokens on the protocol platforms today. It limits mainstream adoption. It's been shown to be a vulnerable implementation model, both from a market perspective as well as a security perspective. Smart contracts are great for some things, but they can be limiting when it comes to token issuance. Of course, these challenges imply a set of requirements for mainstream adoption. So tokenization performance on the scale of thousands of transactions per second is required to realize mainstream adoption. Predictable costs that are fixed, denominated ideally in fiat. It could be USD, it could be other fiat, but the cost per transaction needs to be predictable so that as a token is used over time, the system costs for the developer are predictable and stable. There needs to be stable governance, which is critical in the context of compliance, so that you know that you're building your asset on a network which is governed by leading institutions and that is able to reflect those compliance requirements. Natively, it's customizable so that you can create a token suited for the needs of a specific application, whether it's a fully regulated security, a stable coin for payments, a crypto collectible, or any other token. This can be customized in the token itself. Ideally, that's what you'd like to see. And it's fundamentally decentralized in that you can have decentralized control of the token, its supply, and any of the other features or roles or behaviors for the token. For example, there needs to be a supply manager that can mint and burn tokens. That role should be decentralized through the use of a multi-sig capability. Maybe hierarchical multi-signatures are required for executing a change or a transaction by the supply manager. There needs to be a KYC controller that can KYC accounts and govern that. and an account controller for the freezing or unfreezing of accounts and wiping tokens. All of these roles need to be able to be defined and need to be decentralized through multi-sig capability. So there are a whole range of different token types that could be implemented. This is a list of some of those, many of those. What I'd like to do here in the final minutes is just focus on a single use case and talk about how tokenization can dramatically change the value prop for that use case. So a prominent use case is track and trace of supply chain activities, and specifically recording when and where a product was made and the details of its flow through the supply chain. Supply chain is a use case for distributed ledger technologies, maybe one of the oldest and the earliest that was identified as realizing value from distributed ledger technology. Track and trace, tracking and tracing when and where a product was made can help provide transparency and reduce fraud, which of course is of some value. However, creating a token that represents the widget that's being produced makes it possible to not only record the same information that's used for track and trace, but also enables the buying and selling of that same widget by moving the token between accounts. Digital tokens are designed for economic activity, and this trend is going to continue. I expect that soon products and services generally throughout the world economy will be tokenized for the reasons I've just described. If you combine tokenization with fiat-backed stablecoins and the world of decentralized finance, which basically just means componentized finance that's programmable, that can be built into workflows associated with supply chain activities. If you combine those three, that will fundamentally change the existing processes for things like purchase order financing, obtaining loans or working capital, loans for working capital, purchasing shipping or product insurance, or securing inventory financing, or finally, invoice factoring. So everywhere there is a finance component in the workflow associated with the supply chain activity and the tracking and tracing of the widgets that are flowing through the supply chain, the entire workflow can and will be revolutionized in the coming years. So let's take a look now to wrap things up very briefly at the Hedera token service. What Hedera provides is what we believe addresses the obstacles to mainstream adoption of tokenization, including enabling users to set their own compliance controls, ensuring that tokens can scale with fast finality. The time it takes for a transaction to happen is measured in seconds, and it's 100% final, meaning you know with 100% certainty that it's completed. It's not probabilistic. There are low predictable fees that do away with the need for high and varying gas costs that are associated with other platforms. And Hedera has stable governance due to its global council of some of the world's largest organizations that span multiple sectors and geographies. All tokens run at the speed and security of the native cryptocurrency, which is HBAR, without the need for slow smart contracts to perform atomic swaps. Tokenization is implemented as a native service in the Hedera platform. Well, with that, I hope it was educational. I hope maybe you learned something, certainly about my perspective on the importance of tokenization going forward. And thank you again for the opportunity to be here.